Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So many Californians are back in gear now that September is here and summer is behind us. But unfortunately, the same goes for our liberal politicians who can't seem to keep their hands off Californians' wallets. So PRI's Kerry Jackson wrote about all of these schemes to increase taxes in the Times of San Diego. It was a great piece. So why don't we go over some of them? So let's start with this ACA 1, Assembly Constitutional Amendment 1, that will, once again, erode the protections from Proposition 13. So if ACA 1 becomes law, it's going to lower the two-thirds voter approval requirement for Prop 13 for passing these special local tax hikes to only 55%. And another bill, ACA 13, would require that any ballot measure that changes voter thresholds must be approved by the same margin. So, Tim, what's your take on these bills and what are the chances of them passing?
Well, they're already passing is the part of it. The Assembly approved both measures last week, and this week is, as we'll be discussing later today on our podcast, it's the last week of session, and so even though they aren't required to pass them this year, it's a pretty safe bet that these are full steam ahead to be on the ballot next year. So, I think ACA 1 is really troubling for, we've had, if you look at all the problems faced by cities across California on crime, homelessness, etc., the answer is always from the local politicians, let's spend more money, let's have more money. Well, if you have an ACA 1 pass, you could see a host of local tax measures go on the ballot next year and in the following years. And there's no requirement that one will be the end of it. Anytime there's a new big problem, well, let's put a tax on it to, get some more dedicated funding to throw money at it. And it's probably going to be very hard that you would be able to muster under 55% of the vote for those measures. Two-thirds is a high hurdle to clear, and for good reason, because we don't want to have tax increases being pushed down our throats every 5 minutes. So, think of how bad taxes are in California. Make it 10 times worse if you have a measure like this. You could see every election, the city of LA having multiple tax increase measures. They're all going to sound wonderful. No one's going to look at them in the cumulative. And really, these are going to be hits on homeowners because there are going to be a lot of parcel taxes that they're going to be pushing for these. And, you're not going to see it, or they're going to say, oh, it's only $100 a year if you do this. Well, if you're continually having these come on the ballot at the local level, you're going to have a huge increase in your taxes. It's probably the real end run around Prop 13 if you're going to have little parcel tax after little parcel tax that can pass with 55% or little sales tax or little whatever tax it is. So I think that's really the most troubling one. ACA 13, is also a terrible one because, if you look at all of these bills, it's really the last check on power of the liberal majority in Sacramento is the people. And when you put in something like ACA 13, and keep in mind, all of these require voter approval. So simple majority of voters will have to pass these measures for them to take effect. But ACA 13 says that, you have to get a 2/3 vote in order to have these measures changing tax threshold win approval. Well, that is, that's going to be very difficult in order to get, and it really ties the hands of voters and citizens groups who may want to have a check on the tax raising power of Sacramento. You shouldn't have to have these, kind of extra voter thresholds to limit their taxes. So I think they're both very troubling, but I think that ACA 1, get ready for tax increase after tax increase, especially if you, live in a city like San Francisco or Los Angeles or Sacramento, and get ready for their Free Cities Index ranking to be made much, much worse, because why would you live in those cities when you're going to have potentially huge new local taxes imposed on you as a homeowner.
Well, Tim, I'm going to be optimistic because historically voters have opposed measures that would undo the protections from Prop 13. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the voters will do the right thing. But that said, speaking of ballot initiatives, there's this new bill that changes the language on ballot initiatives to, instead of yes or no, keep the law or overturn the law. I thought this is really interesting because how many questions have there been on the ballot that meant that if you say no, you want the measure to pass, and if you say yes, you don't want the measure to pass? I think it's been very confusing to voters. This makes a lot of sense to me. Of course, it still doesn't do anything about how squirrely some of these propositions are written, or not having the yes and no vote makes it a little more clear this way, keep the law or overturn the law. What do you think?
Well, I think if you're just talking about it in terms of that kind of change, does that make sense? Maybe, but the intent behind this is certainly not that. The intent behind this is labor unions and special interests feel like, quote, the voters are being confused by a yes-no vote, and they're losing largely at the ballot. So this is another way for them to try to push the ballot process in their favor, potentially, by having a keep the law, overturn the law kind of phrasing for initiatives. They're betting that it's going to be much harder to overturn a law by asking, do you want to keep or overturn the law? It's an easier ask to say yes or no. So we'll see. I think the voters are ultimately pretty smart and would see through a ruse. But certainly the intent behind it is another chip away at the initiative process and another chip away at the last check that, Californians have on the liberal majority in Sacramento, which is at the ballot box.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, the real problem with those ballot initiatives is how they are put forth to the voter. It's very confusing, and a lot of times how the measure is described isn't exactly what it does. And I think that's added a lot of confusion and misguided voters into voting a yes or no for whatever the proposition is.
That's right. And that's one of the reforms that has been proposed before that, of course, has been voted down, is to take away the ability. The Attorney General actually writes those titles and summaries that you see in the voter book, and they're very politicized. And so to have the legislative analyst or the auditor or someone who's a more nonpartisan figure write a really straight description of what the measure would do, I think that would go a long way toward addressing this problem. But and kind of thinking about all of these measures that we've talked about today, you often hear Democrats talk about we're putting our thumb on the scale, we're politicizing the elections process. Well, when you hear your Democrat friends say that, just remember these bills and remember that putting your thumb on the scale in the political process is a bipartisan thing.
Finally, let's talk a little bit about this whole idea of banning books, getting a lot of attention in the media. There's a California bill that would prohibit school boards from banning books, instructional materials, or curricula that are deemed to be, quote, inclusive and diverse. And it's clear the Senate, the concept of banning books is really a terrible thing. But children are minors, and parents should be the final decision makers for what their children read or not read. California is a very diverse state. There are some liberal coastal areas where parents might not have any concerns, but in other areas of the state, parents might not be too happy about it. Some communities have cultures and families that are reluctant to have their children read this material because they might believe that it's just too mature for the age of their children. And I think their voices ought to be heard.
As we've seen over the last year, the only bodies that are doing anything different than kind of the status quo in Sacramento have been various school boards around the state. And you can agree or disagree with some of the measures they've been putting forward, but we see bills like this AB 1078. It's a reaction to one of the lowest levels of government, probably the ultimate, neighborhood policymaking body, your local school board, actually listening to the voices of their parents and the voters in their community. And Sacramento, of course, does not want them to do that. They want them to do what Sacramento wants them to do. It does not surprise me that they would push these bills. Local control, parental rights, parental control is something that's obviously not on the agenda in Sacramento, and AB 1078 is certainly another example of that. We certainly have profiled a lot of these parents in our Lance Azumi's book, The Great Parent Revolt, and parents are really frustrated with what's going on in their local schools. And, they grow even more frustrated when they see Sacramento trying to prevent local school boards from being responsive to what parents and students and voters, are telling them they want them to do. It's why local school boards in our recent PRI national survey on voter attitudes on local schools and local school boards said that, they are not that enthusiastic with the job that their local school boards are doing, because they are listening to forces that they shouldn't be listening to. Parents don't have the influence and the say that they think they ought to have. So, doesn't surprise me, and I expect we'll see more bills like this coming from Sacramento, unfortunately.
Well, before we move to our podcast guests, we've got a couple of announcements. If you're in the LA or Orange County area, we have a terrific event coming up. We're hosting the one and only Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. So we're excited to have him. The dinner is at the California Club in Los Angeles, September 25th. And for Northern Californians, on Saturday, October 14th, we'll be having our Northern California Gala with keynote speaker, renowned historian and political scientist Neil Ferguson. And so we'd love to have all of you join us. And all the details are on our website at pacificresearch.org.
Well, this week on Next Round, we're expanding our discussion of some of these end of session issues with our Stephen Greenhut. We have a tradition where he comes on our podcast every year for kind of an end of session review, and this year does not disappoint. We talk about all of the hot issues in the end of legislative session: crime, taxes, education, kind of all the issues we're working on with Free Cities Center, like homelessness and urban renewal. And as always, we focus on a couple of the bills that you're not following that you should be following. So it's a very interesting discussion of all of these end of session issues. And I think you'll be, if you like what's going on in Sacramento, you'll be interested in our discussion today.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Steve Greenhut. Welcome to PRI's podcast, Steve. How are you?
Oh, doing great. How are you guys?
Fine, thank you. So, Steve, we're so happy to have you back to do our annual end of session legislative review. The biggest thing that happened during 2023 session was not the passage or defeat of a bill, but rather the inauguration of a new speaker, Robert Rivas. They had a very long and, by all accounts, pretty frosty transition lasting the first half of the year. So here's a two-part question for you. How do you think legislative historians 20, 30 years from now will rate Anthony Rendon's speakership? And how do you grade our new speaker in the style and policy changes he's put in place so far?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to remember this session 20 or 30 years from now. I don't think it was all that remarkable, but the bitter feud certainly has made for interesting political stories, and both Rendon and Rivas are progressives. I've seen some stories try to put it in a moderate to progressive kind of storyline, but I don't see a huge difference in political priorities between the two of them. I mean, I guess for aficionados of different flavors of progressivism, there's something there, but I'm not that attuned to that. There were some personal differences and style differences. And I think, Rendon is from Lakewood, LA area, and Rivas is from the Salinas area. So it's maybe more significant that he's representing an agricultural area, and his focus, as he grew up in farm worker housing, and more of a focus on agricultural workers and some of the concerns, outside of the two major metro areas. So maybe that's of most significance. And, Rendon was, I guess he was there for 6 years, second only to Willie Brown. And, he angered progressives when he sensibly killed that Senate Bill 400, which was going to create a whole single payer system in California, and it was just really more of a blueprint than a detailed piece of legislation. And there were complaints, I guess, about whether he was a strong enough leader and whether he was open enough to his members. But it got oddly personal. And Rivas had collected 34 cards pledging support, and Rendon refused to acknowledge that. And then Rivas went and issued a press release, but apparently didn't have enough votes. And then they negotiated a transition that lasted 6 months. Rivas took over June 30th. Rendon was termed out anyway. And then he kind of expressed a certain amount of bitterness. But, it is a very powerful position. It appoints all the committee chairs. Newsom likes Rivas. Rivas is good on housing issues, in my view, but to some degree, but not on much of anything else. As a supervisor, he supported a ban on fracking. But I think that there's going to be a different way of doing business. He might be more moderate on crime issues and concerns that Rendon wasn't. So I've been trying to get a read on whether much changed in the couple months since he's been in charge, and I can't really get a sense. I mean, we could look at the budget and maybe a public safety committee hearing that we'll discuss later. But that's pretty much what I've seen.
So on the issues, it seemed that no issue got more attention this legislative session than crime. And it seemed like no committee was a bigger source of headaches for Democrats at the Capitol than the Public Safety Committee. And we saw on issues like the fentanyl crisis and human trafficking, there was a real great divide between progressives kind of rigidly adhering to their ideology on criminal justice and moderate Democrats and Republicans and, a lot of the public who were demanding action from Sacramento. So how do you view this kind of growing disconnect between a lot of folks at the Capitol and the public at large? And do you think this is an area where a Speaker Rivas might be more along the lines with where the public's at versus a Speaker Rendon who really empowered these far left committee chairs to block what, are, by all accounts, pretty widely popular proposals?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think the public, regardless of political viewpoint, is pretty frustrated with crime. I mean, we just saw that smash and grab at an LA Nordstrom's with, I think, 30 to 50 hooded people, hoodlums, whatever you want to call them, coming and doing a smash and grab robbery and stealing like $100,000 worth of handbags at a Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m., prime shopping time. That sort of thing really upsets people. And we see in San Francisco that like nearly 50% of the businesses in the Union Square area are shutting down or have shut down, and mostly they point to retail theft. And there's definitely quite a crime wave going on. In fact, at PRI's event, the head of Raley's detailed all his many frustrations in dealing with the crime situation and his large grocery chain. So it's a huge problem. The public's upset about it, and yet the Assembly Public Safety Committee is kind of locked into this ideological viewpoint. We're not going to put anybody else in jail or prison. I'm a supporter of criminal justice reform, but those have to be carefully done. And, just giving a green light to shoplifting, as one bill that's still alive in the legislature would do, by forbidding employers from confronting shoplifters. I mean, that sort of thing is just kind of crazy. In the Assembly Public Safety Committee, there was a bill, Senate Bill 14, which added human trafficking of a minor to a list of serious felonies for enhanced penalties. I mean, that seems pretty unobjectionable, and it passed the Senate unanimously. But true to form, the committee, they didn't even vote on it. Most members abstained, and that just killed it. And there was a huge backlash, and on social media in particular. And Senator Grove was a conservative from Bakersfield. It was her bill. And they were able to get Rivas. That goes back to your point. Rivas and Newsom ended up supporting it, publicly supporting it, and the committee eventually passed it. But it's a good example of how the legislature often puts ideology over public concerns and is out of step with the public and the concern. And when I read the opposition to the bill in the committee, like in the assembly analysis, it was all over ideological stuff, concerns about excessive enhancements and concerns about three strikes. Those are legitimate discussions, but they took it so far that they created a backlash. And I don't know, maybe that offers a certain opportunity to Republicans to maybe take a sensible criminal justice reform approach, but also to support tougher penalties for genuinely awful crimes. And the committee got its comeuppance, and it deserved it.
So, Steve, your writing this year is focused on issues related to urban renewal with your work for PRI's Free Cities program. One of the key issues in this area has been the debate over California's housing policy. So lawmakers took some steps forward in reducing housing red tape, but others continued to come up with the usual bad ideas like expanding rent control. So what grade would you give the legislature on housing this session? And what are some of the other measures related to urban renewal that you've been following for the Free City Center?
So at the Free City Center, we're looking at constructive ways to improve urban policy, and we criticize existing policy. Of course, there's a lot to criticize in our bigger cities in particular, but we're trying to look for constructive ways forward. And as far as a grade, it's hard because the legislature does actually on housing has done some really good things over the past few years, and there's an understanding. Scott Wiener, Democrat from San Francisco, has been leading the charge. There's an understanding of the need to streamline some of these approval processes. And, the Legislative Analyst's Office several years ago did a report and showed that the state is underbuilding new housing construction and put the blame, squarely on regulations such as CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. Unfortunately, though, the legislature hasn't addressed CEQA directly. And, at Free Cities, we're interested in, creating more housing overall, right? There's a piece on the Free City Center website going up this week that looks at the need to not only permit housing in the urban footprint, but allow it in the suburban area also, because housing markets are regional, and the state's legislature is focused on increasing density. So sometimes that leads to good bills, like Senate Bill 9 and 10. Basically, they create by right approvals for duplexes in single family neighborhoods and small condo complexes along transit lines. And there are a lot of bills like that. So there are like 3 bills this year. One further streamlines approvals. One extends the state's ADU law, the accessory dwelling unit law. Another limits CEQA abuse on housing projects. So there's a lot of good stuff in that direction. But the state still won't deal with CEQA, and they still won't make it easier to build suburban style housing. So I don't know. I'd probably give them a B- this year. But there is one really good bill that's still alive, Senate Bill 423. It basically extends a previous bill, Senate Bill 35, which was about to sunset, creates a builder's remedy, which means it streamlines housing in cities that are behind in their housing goals. And what it does significantly is it extends it to the coast and coastal cities. And the California Coastal Commission has stopped opposing the bill anyway. So that's a pretty good bill. A lot of cities, liberal and conservative, have been fighting some of these new housing mandates. Huntington Beach in Orange County, a conservative-run city, has filed a lawsuit against the state, and they're using all these NIMBY rationales. But a state analysis found that San Francisco, big surprise, has the longest timeline in building. Other cities and liberal cities in like Marin County and coastal cities have been finding every sort of excuse not to implement SB 9 and 10. So I'm happy that the legislature is at least trying to address those issues, but their goals are different than mine. My goal is to free up housing everywhere, and their goal is to promote density. So sometimes that overlaps, and we're in agreement, but they're still, again, kind of ideologically committed to this new urbanism idea, rather than just to reduce regulations all around and fixing CEQA and just make it easier to build. That's what we need to do.
Of course, one of the main debates every year is over the state budget, and one of the highest profile issues in this year's budget was transportation funding, and specifically a bailout for California's lagging public transportation systems. You wrote a terrific booklet for our Free City Center this year called Putting Customers First, where you document our state's public transportation challenges, and anyone interested can go to pacificresearch.org/free cities and download a copy of it. So given this year's latest transit funding giveaway and the ongoing push, of course, for high-speed rail, what can realistically be done going forward to change how we approach both transportation policy and funding? You know, Californians are more dissatisfied than ever before with public transit and lack of traffic congestion relief, yet it seems like Sacramento still continues to bail out the status quo.
Yeah, it was very frustrating. As you know, I've argued before, whenever there's a budget deficit, that's usually the only time when California makes sensible policy choices. When we had that massive surplus, it was just, the spending train just got ratcheted up. And I remember in 2012, when Jerry Brown faced like a $30 billion budget deficit, he modestly reformed pensions and did some cuts. This year, the state basically papered over a $32 billion deficit with gimmicks, delays in spending and additional borrowing, fund shifts. And they did pass, there was some pushback, but they did finally pass a pushback from Governor Newsom, actually. The legislature did pass a $5.1 billion transit bailout. And the problem with that, is that transit ridership is falling. It's falling dramatically. And just bailing out the transit systems will just mean, like any government agency or government program, and it's just going to mean business as usual. They get the money they need. They're just going to continue to do the things that they're going to continue doing. In private industry, obviously, if a company is facing a budget problem, it has to find ways to shave costs and to improve service or their products or whatever. And public agencies, they just take more money and then they run out of it, and then they complain that they don't have enough money. So one of the main problems, like BART in the Bay Area in particular, is having a terrible crime wave. And as I pointed out in the book, in Los Angeles during COVID, they made ridership free, LA Metro, and then it turned the buses into basically roving homeless shelters. And ordinary commuters don't want to, put themselves at risk. And women riders in particular, according to surveys that the transit agencies have done themselves, are avoiding the transit system for obvious reasons. So they're not really fixing that, and just giving them more money will not prod these transit agencies, to make changes. And I go into a lot of detail about why that is, but we just treat transit in this country. We throw a lot of money at it, and there's not a lot of emphasis in focusing on customers and making it a better ridership experience. And ultimately, people are voting with their feet, and they're driving more. And as far as overall transportation policy, I always say, it's a cliche, I guess, at this point, but the state puts social engineering above transportation engineering. State agencies seem almost entirely focused in pushing us out of our cars instead of creating transit systems that people might want to take. And one of the best examples are those nutty road diets where Sacramento implemented them, and we've gotten to see how they work. They're reducing the number of road lanes to promote traffic safety, but that's just leading to crazy congestion. So they got a lot more money, the state, for funding transportation, and they're using it to actually reduce lanes and create more congestion. So the state needs a whole new approach. I was looking at one study from SCAG that I referenced in the book, the Southern California Association of Governments. The median SCAG area, Southern California resident takes 0 transit trips a year. So the people just aren't really using it. And the way to deal with falling transit ridership is to create safer, better transit systems. And I have a good video with Mark Jaffe, who's a transportation expert on the Free City Center website, and we go into a lot of detail on that.
So every session, liberal lawmakers flex their political muscles to give their union allies more power and influence over the private sector and take away worker freedom. And this year, of course, was no exception. You wrote of the various union legislative priorities this session that, quote, public employee unions rule the state of California, so we should expect more strikes and higher taxes, unquote. So explain your thinking here, and what were some of the measures considered this year that, in your view, will make the problem worse?
Unions have been getting pay raises despite the deficit. We're seeing more labor action. We're seeing strikes, municipal strikes, or threatened strikes. So it's amazing because public employees in California are extremely well compensated, and they get the kind of pensions that most people in the private sector only dream about. There's no effort to address the pension crisis. Ever since 2012, when Jerry Brown signed the modest Public Employee Pension Reform Act, which just around the edges reduced pensions, there's been no appetite at all to deal with these things. CalPERS, the California Public Employee Retirement System, I guess the nation's largest pension fund, is only 72% funded. That means they just have less than 3/4 of the money they need to pay out all their pension promises. And if we go into a real recession, that funding level could drop. So, unions pretty much get what they want, but it's not just liberals. The worst bill this year was Assemblyman Heath Flora's 1254. He's a Republican from Modesto, that it gives automatic pay raises to CAL FIRE firefighters to bring them up to the level of state firefighters. Now, the average CAL firefighter earns $200,000 to $253,000 a year in total compensation. They get to retire at age 50 with 90% or more of their final year's pay. And, those are pretty generous compensation packages. And if we look at Transparent California, which lists it's a website that lists all the different pay packages for individual public sector employees, you'll see $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 pay packages for firefighters. And yet the municipal firefighters earn like 20 to 40% more. So this bill would take it outside of collective bargaining and just automatically bring them up to a level closer to what the municipal firefighters earn. It was, I think, a year or two ago, Republican Phil Chen authored a bill that stopped local cities such as Calamasa and Placentia had done this from creating their own fire departments to get out from under CalPERS pension rules, and that they stopped any other city from doing that. Of course, liberal Democrats have been the biggest promoters of public sector unions. It just usually ends up being which unions we're talking about, where with Republicans being really bad on the public safety unions and the Democrats being bad on all the unions. So another union issue, Governor Newsom signed, I think it was AB at 257. It was a sectoral bargaining bill for the fast food industry. It provides, it's like a European style model where a government panel would decide working conditions and pay rates for the fast food industry, and it would undermine the franchise model. And that is qualified for a referendum. So then as a workaround, the governor pushed forward AB 102, and it's just an appropriations bill that provides $3 million to the Industrial Welfare Commission. And that revives a moribund panel and gives it the same powers to do what that legislation would have done, which is to set conditions in the fast food industry. So that was a union promoted bill. And they never learned. They didn't learn from AB 5 and from some of these other measures. That was the bill that essentially banned independent contracting. So the unions still are in control, and there's just nothing we can do about it right now.
Of course, liberal lawmakers have never met a green mandate they didn't like, and this year was certainly no exception. So give us a status report on some of the environmental measures that lawmakers pushed this session that, in your view, could mean higher costs and more restrictions on Californians.
Yeah, there's always, it seems like every climate-related bill seems to move forward. I think the biggest concern is there's a climate bond that would spend $15 to $16 billion on climate measures. Some of the specifics that it would do, invest money in regional conveyance, dam safety, recycled water. I mean, some of those type of projects, I had no problem with. I mean, in my book on California water policy, Winning the Water Wars, for the PRI book, I promote investment in some of these things. But another bond, I mean, the state's talking about putting like almost $80 billion in new bonds on the 2024 ballot. And they just need to make priorities and spend that money out of the existing budget, which is sufficient for these things. An act that would have divested from coal investments that failed. But there's a sea of legislation. And there were some cutbacks in the enormous $54 billion the state spends in climate programs. I mean, I couldn't believe it was that much money. And some of that was trimmed to make the budget, to get rid of the budget deficit. But the problem is the state is totally committed to a carbon-free future, even as, without developing new sources of energy. It's just more of the same mandates, and I don't see anything stopping that right now.
So a new caucus was formed this session. It's called the End Poverty in California Caucus, which seems like more like a PR exercise and a serious effort to actually lift people out of poverty. You called the efforts of the new caucus, quote, no more realistic than a student body president offering free pizza on Fridays. So what are some of the policy proposals that the new caucus is talking about enacting? And with the new dynamic under Speaker Rivas, how influential do you think they will be in influencing the debate on poverty and other related issues at the Capitol?
The legislators have a number of different caucuses. They're usually centered around ethnic groups or policy prescriptions or regional interests, like the Bay Area caucus. And End Poverty in California, EPIC, it echoes the Upton Sinclair's 1934 gubernatorial campaign, in which he basically proposed eliminating the entire private economy because he was a socialist. And unfortunately, some of the ideas, although they don't have a specific package that I've seen yet, but the ideas we're talking about are not going to be helpful. I mean, the state does have an enormous poverty problem. I think we have like a 13% poverty rate, and we're the highest in the nation. And when you adjust that for the cost of living, it's even higher. But there's no recognition from what I see. I was reading the materials and watching their video. No recognition that the government here has any culpability in that situation. We're the most progressive state with the most progressive policies, and we have the highest income inequality and the most poverty. It was the brainchild, apparently, of Michael Tubbs, the former Stockton mayor. And he's this young progressive who I think spent so much time kind of championing his image as a national Democratic rising star that he didn't tend to business at home. And in a city that has a 2-to-1 Democratic voter majority, he lost his mayoral race to a Republican. So Tubbs' big idea was universal basic income, where you just provide a dollar amount to people with no strings attached. And he implemented a UBI program it was privately funded, but the supporters of UBI definitely want the government to fund it. He did that in Stockton, and then some nonprofit group interviewed the people and found that, oh wow, this worked really well. People are a lot happier when they have more money than when they don't. big surprise. But that's not the way to get rid of poverty. And I saw a hearing where Tubbs was at the legislature, where Tubbs was testifying, and he talked about things like baby bonds, where the government provides a bond for every baby born in the country, UBI, of course, and then housing is a right. Of course, if housing is a right, then somebody has to be forced to provide that housing, and that sort of talk will be disastrous for the state's housing market, and so it's all going to be bad policies. Isaac Bryan, who's the head of that caucus, is very close to Rivas, so I assume it'll have a lot of support at the highest levels of the legislature. And one thing the legislature could do is to stop killing jobs. I mentioned AB5 before. That killed a lot of jobs, and the legislature had to respond by exempting 100 plus industries from its provisions because there was so much blowback. This sectoral bargaining law that I discussed, that will also kill fast food jobs. So maybe they should stop killing jobs, first do no harm, and look at the ways we can improve the economy without simply just handing out more money. So I don't expect anything good from this new caucus.
So there were several issues that the legislature made little progress on this year. And one key issue that you wrote about was California's insurance problem. And we're seeing more and more insurance companies starting to pull out of offering policies in the state. Yet we've really seen inaction from the legislature and the insurance commissioner. And now we're seeing a crumbling state insurance market. So what, in your view, explains this inaction from Sacramento? And what are some of the policies that you think policymakers will need to embrace to prevent this from growing into a full-blown crisis?
Yeah, we really are headed towards a crisis here. I mean, the big news, and to get insurance into the news is really takes something amazing. But State Farm had announced, I think it was 2 or 3 months ago, that it was not going to write any new homeowner insurance policies, and they're like 21% of the market. And then Allstate made a similar announcement. And then this week there were 2 other smaller insurers that announced that they're not writing new policies. And the problem in California is that we don't have enough competition. Where a lot of people are having trouble. A lot of homeowners in particular are having trouble getting home insurance, fire insurance. And it's especially in wildland adjacent areas where wildfires are a big problem. And the FAIR plan, that is the industry funded but state created insurer of last resort, is kind of a bare bones insurer that you wouldn't want to insure with them, but if you have no other choice, it's better than nothing. They have 3 times the number of policies that they should. So the state's policy is essentially forcing people into this backstop system. And Ricardo Lara, the insurance commissioner, has been kind of like a deer in the headlights. I haven't seen him doing much of anything that's helpful. The main problem goes back to Prop 103, which was the voter-supported initiative that gave the insurance commissioner powers to set rates, a prior approval insurance system. So if you're an insurance company, you have to get the approval of the insurance commissioner before you raise rates. And the insurance commissioner also would have the power to roll back rates. So it distorted the market, and insurance companies have not been able to price their policies accurately. And there's such a lag time. It takes 6 years, sometimes up to 6 months, sometimes up to 2 years to get an approval through the Department of Insurance. Often leads to legal cases. One case that I had written about, State Farm was ordered, it was like 7 years ago, to roll back rates, and they finally won their case, but it took years. And then they still had to pay the intervener fees. Those are the fees to the consumer activists, attorneys who supposedly argue on behalf of the public as part of this nutty system that we created. Now, you can't change Prop 103 without a vote of the people, but there are things that the insurance commissioner could do to make the process easier. and keep insurers from fleeing the state. He could implement rules that streamline the approval process so that it doesn't take so long to get a rate hike approval or some ruling on the rate hike. They could allow insurers to include their growing cost of reinsurance. That's the insurance that insurance companies buy, and allows them to offer far more policies because it spreads out the risk. That he could allow them to, include the rising reinsurance costs as part of their rate approval process. But we're finding that car insurers are complaining too, and are threatening to pull out. And Consumer Watchdog, the group that advocates for Prop 103, wanted LARA to force the insurers to write new policies, and that was fortunately, LARA said that was not in their authority. So it's a mess, and there needs to be some leadership. And I haven't seen any major hearings in the legislature on it, and I haven't seen the insurance commissioner take a proactive approach. And we could have some real problems if this, if the state doesn't get this under control, because obviously insurance is fundamental to everything a business does, fundamental to being able to own a home, and rising insurance costs are inflationary.
So we all know that reporters are overworked. So what one or two bills were you following this session that didn't get the media attention they deserved, but have the potential to be very impactful in California?
Well, yeah, I had mentioned SB 423 before, which is in fact, I'm going to write my column about it this week, about the attempt to allow more building in the coastal region. I think that's a good bill. That's that needs more attention. And I didn't see a lot of attention to another bill I mentioned, the appropriations bill that led to the refunding of the Industrial Welfare Commission. But what I really wanted to point to is the California Chamber of Commerce's job killer list. There still are quite a few job killers, and some of these bills are just unbelievable. And there's a bill here, AB 524, that exposes employers to more costly litigation under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And here's a AB 647 that significantly expands statute related to successor grocery employees, basically limiting the ability of grocery stores to reduce their workforce. And there are all sorts of bills that undermine arbitration or bans employer speech. Here's a minimum wage increase, SB 525, to $25 an hour for healthcare facilities and any employer who works with healthcare facilities. And this is just, it's maybe not just per se one or two bills. It's just so many of these bills. Here's one, SB 799, that would increases employment insurance taxes to subsidize striking workers. Can you imagine that? So there are just so many. There was a proposal for a wealth tax, as if California isn't taxed enough. And here's another bill, AB 1000, that is the chamber calls a de facto ban on warehouses by mandating a statewide setback of 1,000 feet from sensitive receptors for all new or expanded facilities. These really are. I just don't understand how we can. That one failed passage, but I don't understand how the state continues to complain about poverty, complain about the economy, and yet continues to pass these bills, or at least propose the bills. And in the old days, crazy bills would get proposed that legislators were making a point. Now they get really far and sometimes pass. So it's hard to understand.
So finally, Steve, let's end with a question about Gavin Newsom. He had a very interesting year dealing with the legislature as he increasingly turned his attention to fighting with Republican governors in other states. Now, one could argue he lost the budget battle with the legislature, yet He saw some progress with his key initiative for mental health funding, though that has been a difficult path of negotiations for him. So with his attention seemingly going national and obviously his lame duck status growing by the day, do you think Newsom is losing his edge over the legislature?
It's a good question. I think I always complained that Newsom, he would always throw out lots of big ideas, but didn't seem like a master of the details. I mean, Jerry Brown, you remember Brown, he seemed like he had the legislature doing whatever he wanted, and he seemed to master the details. And Newsom spent a lot of time this year in Alabama and raising money. He raised $10 million for a PAC attacking red state governors, which financed billboards in southern states. And then it just seemed like he's all over the place. He complained actually in one news article I read recently where he had to keep repeatedly jamming the legislature, as he put it. And maybe that's a sign that he wasn't engaged enough if you have to continually jam the legislature to push things through. He had to threaten vetoing the budget to get his infrastructure streamlining package through. I think that was a good package, but with Newsom, I don't know. Got to trust but verify to see if there's any follow through with it. And then he wanted to have an oil profits penalty, and the legislature beat him on that too. They settled for a transparency bill. And I saw one quote from Rendon who said Newsom got so used to being almost, in my word, a czar during the COVID crisis when he gained all sorts of extreme executive powers, that he got so used to that he didn't really expect pushback, and maybe didn't do as much hard work within the halls of the legislature. So I don't know. I'm not an expert on Newsom, but I wish he would spend more time in California focusing on really important issues rather than this kind of nonsense in other states, and trying to be a national progressive leader. The best way to be a national progressive leader would be to deal with the homelessness crisis here, get the economy going, try to get taxes under control, try to fix our housing market. These are important things. I think if he would actually show some major success here, then he'd have bragging rights rather than just making fun of some of these red state governors, some of whom I think maybe deserve some criticism, but that's their state's problem, not ours.
Thanks so much, Steve. Great interview.
Well, thanks for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.